On July 13th, in the year 1943, Lieutenant Toshihiro Ura turned the pages of his leather-bound diary for what would be the final time. He sat within a hastily equipped bunker, located near Munda Point on the island of New Georgia, where the dim flicker of a candle cast shadows on the makeshift walls. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from the profound emotional and psychological toll accumulated during the preceding 3 days and nights. The words he meticulously inscribed that night would remain forever buried within the archives of American intelligence, hidden from the public eye for many decades to come. Yet, these entries held within them a stark, unvarnished truth about the brutal realities of the Pacific War, truths that both Japanese and Allied forces, in their official accounts, preferred to overlook or deny. What Lieutenant Ura observed in those final days of the battle challenged every preconceived notion either side held about the nature of combat in the treacherous Solomon Islands. Ura was in command of a reinforced infantry platoon tasked with defending the western approaches to Munda Airfield, a critical strategic site. His unit had arrived on the island roughly 3 weeks earlier, sent as part of Japan's desperate effort to cling to control over the chain of islands in the face of mounting pressure from the advancing Allies. This unit, like many others, was thrown into a brutal and unforgiving environment, where survival depended on resilience and adaptability. Notably, Lieutenant Ura's diary contained entries that defied the strict orders of military discipline. Official regulations strictly forbade individuals from keeping personal records, fearing that such writings could be discovered if soldiers were captured, thus risking the compromise of sensitive intelligence. Despite this, Ura's commitment to truth drove him to record every night, not merely numbers and tactical details, but the human stories unfolding in the chaos of war. Among the entries from July 10th, Ura described the final American assault on the airfield. The American forces involved belonged to the 43rd Infantry Division, advancing through dense, tangled jungle terrain that made movement slow and perilous. Through his field glasses, Ura observed the advancing soldiers, expecting to see the reckless, individualistic fighters that Japanese propaganda had painted for months. Instead, what he saw was startling. They were highly coordinated, moving with a precision that appeared almost rehearsed. Behind them, devastating artillery barrage arrived with clockwork regularity, pounding the jungle and the defenders with relentless destruction. More disturbing than the combat tactics of the Americans was what he documented regarding his own men's suffering and decline. His diary conveyed, in clinical and unwavering detail, that over 60% of his platoon had fallen ill with malaria, a disease that had severely weakened their fighting capacity. Supplies, which had been promised by naval convoys, had never materialized, leaving the soldiers to endure shortages. The scarcity was so dire that rice rations were reduced to 1/3 of the normal amount, leaving the men on the brink of starvation within a jungle environment that, under normal circumstances, could have provided edible plants and other sustenance. Yet, exhaustion, malnutrition, and illness robbed them of the energy and knowledge needed to forage effectively. Their condition was bleak. Weakened, malnourished, and increasingly demoralized, they faced a situation that seemed almost hopeless. On July 12th, Ura received a crucial order. He was instructed to hold his position for an additional 48 hours to permit the evacuation of their headquarters staff and high command personnel. That night, he recorded the expressions etched onto the faces of his men as he relayed the command. The soldiers understood the gravity of what was being asked of them. There was no promise of relief or rescue on the horizon. No reinforcements were coming, and the reality was grim. They were being sacrificed in a strategic maneuver designed to buy time for higher officers to retreat. Their suffering, their sacrifice, was, in many respects, a calculated cost of war. The final entry in Ura's diary, penned on the 13th of July, consisted of just a single paragraph, but one that would later draw significant attention from American translators. When the diary was recovered 3 weeks afterward, this brief note was flagged as particularly meaningful. In the closing moments of his account, Ura acknowledged the pivotal role Munda Point held in the broader context of the conflict. The battle for that small promontory represented a crucial juncture in the Allied campaign to undermine and eventually neutralize Japanese air power within the central Solomon Islands. The Munda Airfield, which had been operational since December of the previous year, provided a strategic launching point for Japanese bombers and fighters. Its existence threatened Allied maritime shipping lanes and posed a formidable obstacle to their expansion in the region. Losing control of Munda would, therefore, tip the balance of air superiority in favor of the Allies, marking a decisive turn in the campaign to dominate the central and southern Solomon Islands. The campaign initiated by Japanese forces in New Georgia commenced on the 30th of June in the year 1943, marking a significant chapter of the Pacific Theater during World War II. On this day, American troops launched an amphibious assault, landing on Renova Island with the strategic objective of establishing artillery positions capable of reaching and threatening the Japanese-held airfield at Munda. This operation was meticulously planned to gain ground and weaken enemy defenses, setting the stage for subsequent advances in the region. At that time, the Japanese garrison defending the vital airfield numbered around 10,000 soldiers. Despite their numerical strength, these troops found themselves at an overwhelming disadvantage due to multiple factors that severely undermined their combat effectiveness and overall endurance. Their supply lines from the sea, critical for provisioning, reinforcements, and medical supplies, had been heavily disrupted and cut off by relentless American air raids and submarine attacks. These interdictions effectively strangled the logistical support necessary for sustaining a large ground force in such a remote and challenging environment. Furthermore, the island's dense jungle terrain, which could ostensibly serve as a natural fortress favoring defenders, instead turned into a lethal trap. The thick foliage and swampy conditions fostered rapid spread of tropical diseases like malaria, dysentery, and other infections, which claimed lives and incapacitated soldiers faster than actual combat could. Malnutrition, connected closely with the disrupted supply chain, compounded the suffering of the Japanese troops, leaving many weakened and unable to perform their duties effectively. Within this context, Lieutenant Ura's unit epitomized the typical composition of Japanese military forces in the Solomon Islands by mid-1943. His men were not a homogeneous or well-prepared force. Rather, they were a motley assembly of seasoned infantry soldiers combined with hastily trained replacements. A significant portion of these soldiers had been transferred from garrison duties in Manchuria, a region far removed from jungle warfare and tropical diseases. As a result, they lacked crucial experience and resilience needed for fighting in such hostile environments. The Japanese command believed that maintaining high fighting spirit and tactical aggressiveness could compensate for their severe shortages of material resources. They operated under the assumption that fierce bravery and relentless offensive tactics would carry the day, even amid logistical chaos. Lieutenant Ura's personal diary would later reveal the tragic consequences of this misguided belief, providing a first-hand account of the deteriorating circumstances faced by his unit. In stark contrast to the Japanese approach, the American troops engaged in a calculated and systematic method of warfare. Rather than launching hasty assaults, they focused on establishing secure and efficient supply routes, constructing field hospitals, and orchestrating massive artillery barges before each subsequent advance. This deliberate strategy aimed to weaken the Japanese defenses gradually and methodically, frustrating their commanders who had anticipated swift counterattacks and close-quarters combat that could turn the tide unexpectedly. Ura observed this pattern with growing awareness, recognizing its importance in the broader scope of the battle. His diary entries, spanning from late June through mid-July of 1943, furnished American intelligence officers with a unique and detailed insight into the structure, morale, and operational methods of the Japanese defensive forces. These writings were ultimately recovered on the 3rd of August, when Marine patrols overran the western bunker complex where Ura's unit had made its last stand. The diary was discovered in a waterproof pouch, carefully hidden alongside Ura's personal possessions and military documents, ensuring its preservation in the treacherous jungle conditions. When translated, this document challenged many preconceptions held by American military analysts regarding Japanese soldiers' resilience and combat capability. Previously, it had been assumed that Japanese units maintained cohesion and effectiveness until they were utterly destroyed on the battlefield. However, Ura's writings told a different story. By early July, his unit was already unraveling, not primarily due to losses inflicted by the enemy, but because of systemic failures in their logistical and medical support systems. The diary vividly depicted how, weeks before the final assault, soldiers were showing signs of physical collapse, many too weak to stand during morning formations or to perform basic duties. Medical supplies were alarmingly scarce. There was an abundance of bandages and iodine, but critically lacking were quinine for malaria treatment, antibiotics for infected wounds, or plasma for shock management. These shortages meant that injuries and illnesses that could have been treated effectively in better-equipped settings often resulted in death. Ura's diary also records a poignant and disturbing incident. On the 8th of July, their medical officer, whom Ura refers to as the medical corpsman, took his own life after witnessing 3 men succumb to treatable dysentery. The note left behind expressed hopelessness and an inability to continue witnessing such suffering due to the absence of essential medicines. By the second week of July, further deterioration was evident in the form of critical food shortages, which compounded the plight of the soldiers. The document described how the naval supply system designed to sustain the Japanese garrisons across the Solomon Islands had completely broken down. The once reliable ships and logistical networks that supplied vital provisions failed to deliver, leaving the troops in a state of increasing deprivation and helplessness. This breakdown was a devastating blow, revealing that the true weakness of the Japanese defense lay not only in their exposed positions, but also within the fragile, collapsing support infrastructure that was meant to sustain them through the protracted campaign. URA's military unit had once been promised consistent and reliable resupply missions delivered swiftly by fast destroyers, known as the Tokyo Express convoys, which had previously achieved significant success in providing supplies to Guadalcanal. However, as the American forces gained air superiority over the region, these vital supply runs became increasingly impossible to carry out. The last full supply shipment that URA's unit managed to receive was on June the 24th, which was nearly exactly 3 weeks before the final, decisive confrontation. His personal diary provides a stark and detailed account of how rapidly malnutrition and lack of resources began to erode the unit's fighting capability. By the 10th of July, URA estimated that fewer than 30 of the initial 85 men who had been part of his force were still capable of carrying out combat duties. The remaining soldiers were incapacitated, suffering from a combination of disease, severe malnutrition, or wounds that refused to heal due to their compromised immune systems. In his writings, Ura vividly described men who could hardly lift their rifles, men who, amid intense exhaustion, fell asleep while on guard duty, not because of carelessness, but because their bodies simply could not sustain the effort. He also recorded instances of soldiers experiencing hallucinations as a result of fever and starvation, symptoms that underscored the dire human toll exacted by the desperate circumstances. What made Ura's observations especially significant to American intelligence efforts was his analytical mindset. Unlike many captured documents of the time, which often focused solely on tactical details or superficial propaganda, Ura's diary sought to understand the underlying reasons for his unit's rapid decline and collapse. His education at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy was reflected in his approach. Having studied military history and logistics extensively, Ura carefully compared Japanese and American operational methods with a clarity that stood out. On the 11th of July, he devoted an extended passage to analyzing American artillery tactics. He observed that the American artillery crews adhered to strict schedules, firing at predetermined times that were precisely coordinated with infantry movements. These bombardments were not aimless acts of harassment, but meticulously planned strikes aimed at neutralizing specific defensive positions before advancing troops moved forward. Ura noted that forward observers working with American artillery units maintained constant communication, making real-time adjustments based on observed battlefield effects, thereby maximizing the accuracy and destructive power of their fire. In contrast, Ura pointed out that Japanese artillery, when it was available, often fired patterns or barrages along predetermined routes, with little or no capacity for immediate adjustment to changing battlefield conditions. His diary described the psychological effects of this systematic and deliberate American approach. Japanese soldiers, previously trained to expect aggressive, close-quarters combat and counterattacks, now found themselves facing an enemy that advanced with slow, disciplined precision. Instead of the swift, brutal battles typical of traditional Japanese tactics, the Americans methodically pushed their lines forward, employing overwhelming firepower, artillery, and air strikes, well before Japanese infantry had the chance to engage. Their ability to destroy defensive positions in advance of the attack left Japanese troops without the opportunity for the close combat engagements their doctrine prized. Ura also recorded conversations with fellow officers who were defending nearby sectors, revealing his growing awareness that traditional Japanese tactical doctrine had become outdated and ineffective against the systematic, technologically advanced American methods. The Japanese emphasis on fighting spirit, aggressive tactics, and a belief in rough tactical parity with an enemy that possessed superior firepower and logistical support was no longer valid in this new battlefield reality. His notes acknowledged that Japanese tactics, once considered daring and resilient, were now essentially suicidal in the face of American operational sophistication and material superiority. Despite this recognition, the command persisted in issuing orders rooted in these outdated assumptions about how battles would unfold, orders that increasingly seemed disconnected from the brutal realities faced on the front lines. The most critical entries in Ura's diary appeared in the final days before his death. On the 12th of July, he documented receiving a direct order to hold his position for 48 hours. This directive represented the last concrete instructions he recorded, emphasizing the desperate and futile stand they had been ordered to make as the Japanese forces gradually succumbed to the relentless, systematic advance of their American adversaries. From the very first moment he saw the chaos unfolding around him, he recognized with piercing clarity that this situation was akin to a death sentence. The command center had already made the decision to evacuate by means of a barge heading toward Kalimanjaro Island, a move that effectively meant abandoning the frontline units in a desperate attempt to slow down the relentless advance of the American forces. Ura did not bother to express criticism or disapproval of this order in his personal diary. Instead, he simply documented it as further evidence of what he had already deeply understood about the inevitable outcome of the campaign. That particular entry also included Ura's own analysis, an honest assessment of why the order to hold the position was militarily senseless. He reasoned that his unit lacked the strength or resources to effectively delay a determined and well-organized American assault for more than a few hours. The soldiers were too exhausted, severely weakened by sickness and fatigue, and suffering from a morale that had plummeted to dangerous lows. They simply could not mount an effective resistance. A tactical withdrawal, he thought, would have been the only logical choice, allowing his forces to regroup and conserve their combat power for future engagements. In the grand strategic picture, such a move might have preserved their fighting capability, but instead, they were being asked to sacrifice themselves for a minimal strategic gain. This wastage of their effort was dictated solely by rigid doctrine that insisted positions be held until they were utterly destroyed, regardless of sensibility or practicality. On July the 13th of that year, Ura dedicated his day to preparing his men for what he knew would be likely their final confrontation. His diary detailed his efforts to sustain what little morale remained among soldiers who, deep down, understood that they had been forsaken by their command. He organized the remaining supplies of food into a final, shared meal, attempting to bring some semblance of dignity and unity to the men. Ammunition was distributed as evenly as possible, although many of the soldiers lacked the strength to carry a full combat load, rendering their chances for prolonged resistance even more hopeless. Ura also wrote letters on behalf of those who desperately wanted to send messages to their loved ones, fully aware that these letters might never reach their destination or be delivered at all. That evening, as he recorded his last entry in his diary, Ura did not indulge in heroic speeches or patriotic declarations. Instead, he offered a clear-eyed, clinical reflection on the situation and what it taught him. He concluded that the Japanese Empire was not doomed because its soldiers lacked courage or fighting spirit. Every single member of his unit exemplified the willingness to die for their country if necessary. The reason they were destined to lose, he argued, lay in the fact that their opponent had developed systems and infrastructure that made individual acts of bravery ultimately irrelevant. The Americans had established comprehensive logistical systems for feeding troops in the jungle, controlling and treating diseases such as malaria, delivering ammunition efficiently, coordinating artillery and air support seamlessly, evacuating wounded personnel rapidly, and replacing losses without significant disruption. Japan, meanwhile, relied on slogans about fighting spirit, which could motivate individuals but could not substitute for robust organizational capacity and systematic logistics. Ura finished his diary with a sobering forecast. He predicted that unless Japan could develop or replicate the logistical and organizational systems that the Americans had perfected, victory would be impossible. No matter how valiant the individual soldiers fought, the war would end in complete defeat. Tactical victories, small successes in isolated battles, might be achievable. However, strategic success depended on the kind of comprehensive, systematic approach that only the Americans had mastered and deployed effectively on the battlefield. His last words expressed a hope that someone might read these writings and understand a fundamental truth. Sheer courage alone could never overpower an enemy armed with superior systems and organizational infrastructure. On the following day, July the 14th, Ura's position was overwhelmed during a lightning-fast assault that lasted less than 2 hours. The American forces, well-organized and relentless, rapidly outflanked and overwhelmed the remaining defenders. Most of the Japanese soldiers, weakened from exhaustion and sickness, were unable to mount any effective resistance. Ura was killed by artillery fire before the American infantry even reached his bunker. His diary, however, was discovered 3 weeks later during cleanup operations on the battlefield and was quickly forwarded to intelligence analysts in Guadalcanal. The translation of Ura's personal account sparked considerable debate among American intelligence officers. Some dismissed his reflections as hopeless defeatist propaganda or questioned the reliability of his personal opinions, viewing them as sentimentality rather than fact. Many experts regarded this assessment as an accurate reflection of Japan's logistical shortcomings during the Pacific War. The diary in question was carefully classified and stored within intelligence archives, where it remained largely forgotten or overlooked for many decades. Nevertheless, contemporary historians who have extensively studied Ura's personal account now regard it as one of the most revealing and insightful Japanese documents from the entire Pacific conflict. This diary offers rare and valuable evidence of how mid-level Japanese military officers perceive the escalating gap between their own military capabilities and those of the United States. In particular, Ura's detailed analysis of the contrasting approaches to warfare, systematic versus individualistic, has been widely cited in numerous studies examining the operational aspects of Pacific theater battles. One of the pivotal moments confirming Ura's forecasts occurred during the fall of Munda Airfield on the 5th of August in the year of 1943. This event decisively verified the predictions outlined in the diary, leading to the subsequent Japanese evacuation to Kalimantan and, ultimately, a complete withdrawal from the Central Solomon Islands. The campaign vividly illustrated that Japanese defensive tactics, no matter how determined, could not compensate for the overwhelming material superiority and organizational readiness of American forces. Every subsequent engagement along the Pacific Front adhered to the pattern Ura had identified: relentless systematic American advances systematically wearing down Japanese positions that suffered from inadequate supplies and support infrastructure. Beyond strategic and tactical insights, the diary also shed light on the heavy human toll inflicted by Japan's strategic failures. Ura's units suffered casualties at an astonishing rate of roughly 85%. However, less than 1/5 of these casualties were a direct result of combat confrontations. The majority of those killed or wounded succumbed to disease, malnutrition, and the absence of proper medical care. This tragic pattern was replicated across many Japanese garrisons scattered throughout the Pacific region, where soldiers often lost their lives not due to enemy activity, but because their own military's logistical shortcomings prevented adequate sustenance and medical support. Ura's observations on American artillery tactics proved especially significant. The meticulous coordination between forward observers, artillery batteries, and infantry units evolved into the defining feature of American operational practice throughout the Pacific campaign. Such seamless integration of firepower and maneuverability enabled American forces to press forward with relatively low casualties, all the while inflicting devastating losses on the defending Japanese forces. Furthermore, the diary's analysis of morale and combat effectiveness offered a more nuanced picture that challenged both Japanese and American wartime propaganda. While Japanese propaganda propagated the myth that spiritual strength and samurai spirit could triumph over material disadvantages, American propaganda depicted Japanese soldiers as fanatical warriors fighting to the death. Ura's diary, however, revealed a more complex, human reality. Japanese soldiers were indeed willing to fight fiercely, but systemic failures, beyond their individual control, gradually eroded their effectiveness and morale. In the aftermath of the war, intelligence analysts recognized that URA had accurately identified the fundamental asymmetry governing the Pacific conflict. Japan's military culture placed a strong emphasis on individual heroism and tactical aggression, whereas America's military doctrine focused on systematic planning, logistical advantages, and organizational superiority. Over long and drawn-out campaigns, these systemic strengths consistently overshadowed individual acts of bravery, proving that in protracted warfare, well-structured logistical and planning systems invariably defeated fleeting heroism. Additionally, the diary documented the disintegration of Japanese naval supply operations. URA's unit was originally expected to receive regular deliveries via the so-called Tokyo Express, fast destroyer runs that supplied essential provisions and reinforcements. By July of 1943, however, the increasing dominance of American air power rendered these logistical missions perilous and ultimately suicidal. The effective interdiction of supply routes further compounded Japan's strategic vulnerabilities, emphasizing how technological and tactical shifts sharply diminished the Japanese ability to sustain their forces in enemy-held territories. Japanese military commanders, in their strategic planning, often operated under the false assumption that supply lines would remain secure and operational throughout their campaigns, despite the ongoing deterioration of those very supply routes. They continued to develop and execute operational plans based on the belief that logistical support would sustain their forces, even as the harsh realities on the ground proved otherwise. This stark disconnect between expectation and reality was keenly observed and understood by someone like Ura, whose detailed diary serves as a poignant example of the importance of logistics, systemic thinking, and realistic assessment in warfare. Ura's writings have gained recognition among modern military analysts primarily because of his insightful reflections on the critical links between supply chains, morale, and combat effectiveness. His observations are frequently referenced in military education as quintessential examples of how wars are ultimately decided, not solely by tactical skill or personal bravery, but far more significantly by the strength and resilience of an organization's systemic support. His diary vividly illustrates that individual acts of courage and tactical brilliance, while commendable, pale in comparison to an establishment's ability to maintain coherent logistics, coordinate complex operations, and adapt to evolving circumstances. The violent events of July 14th, where many of Ura's men faced defeat, served as a tragic real-life testament to his final predictions. The exhausted survivors of that assault were too weak and disorganized to retreat effectively, leading most to be either captured or to succumb during attempts to reach the safety of Japanese lines on Kalimbangara. When American medical personnel treated the captured Japanese soldiers, they were struck by the soldiers' dire physical conditions. Many of the prisoners suffered from severe malnutrition and illness, requiring weeks of treatment before they could be interrogated, revealing the comprehensive failure of supply and health support systems under stress. Ura's diary remains one of the most candid and honest assessments of Japanese military shortcomings during the Pacific War, penned by an active officer engaged directly in combat. His analyses turned out to be tragically accurate. Japan's focus on fighting spirit and tactical aggression alone could not compensate for systemic weaknesses in logistics, coordination, and material readiness. Almost every significant engagement from the Battle of Munda onward followed the pattern Ura described: battles won or lost not by individual heroics, but by the robustness of their organizational backing and logistical support. The significance of Ura's reflections extends beyond their immediate historical context, as they reveal a fundamental truth about modern warfare. That victory is predominantly driven by the ability of organizations to sustain prolonged operations, manage complex systems, and evolve in response to circumstances. Wars are not won merely through slogans, morale, or tactical brilliance alone. Instead, they hinge on behind-the-scenes support structures that ensure supplies, communications, and coordination are maintained effectively over time. In the end, the side possessing superior logistical and systemic capabilities will invariably defeat the one relying only on bravado or ideological slogans. Before his death, Ura expressed a hope that his observations would be read and understood, believing that future military leaders could learn from the mistakes and insights documented in his diary. His writings did indeed reach American intelligence and military strategists, who incorporated his insights into their understanding of Japanese vulnerabilities. Decades later, scholars and analysts continue to study his words, viewing them as a critical case study in how warfare is ultimately decided, not on the battlefield alone, but through the strength and resilience of supporting systems. The soldiers in Ura's unit did not die because of a lack of courage or fighting spirit. Rather, they fell victim to the failure of their military system. They perished in a jungle that, under different circumstances, could have provided sustenance. They succumbed to diseases that could have been treated, and they fought without enough ammunition or adequate support, their sacrifices offering no strategic advantage or long-term benefit. Ura recognized this tragic truth and documented it with brutal honesty, hoping that his frankness might prevent future soldiers from meeting the same fate. The Pacific War, ongoing for another 2 years after the fall of Munda, continued to unfold following the pattern Ura identified. On every island, in every jungle, and along every shoreline where Japanese and American forces clashed, the same critical disparity persisted. One side possessed comprehensive systems of logistics and support, while the other relied solely on slogans and fighting spirit. As this disparity became unmistakably clear, the outcome of each engagement was effectively predetermined, reinforcing the timeless truth that in modern warfare, organizational strength overwhelmingly dictates success or failure. If this story uncovered new insights about the Pacific War that you hadn't previously reflected upon, please consider engaging with the content by hitting that like button and subscribing for more revealing tales from the history of World War II. Which particular detail or aspect of Lieutenant Ura's observations struck you as the most surprising or revealing? I encourage you to share your thoughts and reflections in the comments section below, as your insights can enrich the ongoing conversation. In our next installment, we will delve into yet another compelling moment when individual soldiers faced directly the harsh and often brutal realities inherent in the machinery of industrial warfare. Thank you for taking the time to watch. And remember that history is ultimately shaped not only by those who show extraordinary bravery, but also by those who understand that true courage must be accompanied by awareness, understanding, and resilience.